Hi, my name's Kirsty Page, and in this recording, we're going to look at skills for readiness and progression, where we're going to look at the correlation between areas of child development and different aspects of more formal learning, and introduce the concept of how having a systematic approach to gap closing and gap identification can raise attainment and support our most vulnerable children with their levels of readiness and progression with key formal learning areas. So, whatever aspects of formal learning we are wanting to raise attainment with, I think what we've got to understand is that the systematic approach to gap identification, gap closing, will underpin and then also sit alongside how we teach that aspect of formal learning. So whether it's underpinning and sitting alongside how we teach phonics, or whether it's underpinning and sitting alongside how we teach writing, it's not, your gap identification and your gap closing is complementary. It's about really making sure that as many of your children are ready as possible and holistically with a firm foundation of readiness for this formal learning in the early years, but then alongside that more systematic teaching of phonics or writing or whatever it may be, that we have with our slightly older and our older children that ability to identify and tackle gaps when, for want of a better phrase, what we're doing with everybody else isn't quite working well enough for this individual child or for this group of children. So this is about complementing and building on what you do already. It's not something completely new or something completely different or something that will mean that you have to change everything completely. It's about becoming more systematic with our younger children, but also really allowing us to facilitate progression for those children where, for want of a better phrase, what we're doing at the moment isn't quite enough. So, whatever aspect of formal learning we're wanting to improve, what we need is that developmental understanding about which developmental skills feed into this area of formal learning. And we'll touch on a couple of these towards the end of this video, but also just to bear in mind that future newsletters will pick up different aspects of formal learning and look at them in more detail. So although we'll briefly touch on phonics and writing today, I want to kind of cover more the basic principles within this recording, and then to acknowledge that in future newsletters we will unpick those very specific areas in more detail. So if we go back to having that understanding, whatever we're looking at, what skills feed into this area, but also not just what are the skills that feed into this area, but with those skills, what level equates to readiness. And that is really important. What is ready? What does ready look like? And what does ready sound like in children? And then I can use that information in two ways. I can use it to inform my preparation. It can also be used to help me make more systematic and confident and very specific judgments about readiness, and where children have ongoing needs and issues with readiness, it can really help me unpick where exactly are the gaps and how do I fill those gaps. So if we go right back to that kind of bottom-up approach, if we understand that the skills that feed into overall phonics, for example, or just phonic reading, or overall writing, or an aspect of writing, then it can give us, through our kind of bottom-up strategy, a much more specific approach to preparation. What are all of the skills that we need? What are all the skills that we need to put in place for all of our children in order to create a really holistic and firm base of readiness for this thing that we want to teach them next, this more formal learning. And within that, how do we take children who have got lower levels of success, earlier starting points, where they basically have gaps? How do we take their gaps and differing starting points into consideration? And how do we weave gap closing into our preparation so that we don't distinguish between preparation and intervention? We weave gap closing into the preparation process. And really, I suppose by having that understanding of what are the key skills, but what level equates to readiness, we're really enabling ourselves to kind of have a systematic approach and to ask ourselves, okay, these are our children's starting points, and they're different. Some children are meeting age-related expectations. Some children have little gaps. Some children have quite significant gaps. How do I take that into consideration? But using that systematic incremental approach, how do I get as many children as I can to that point of readiness as possible, but in a really thorough, developmentally, incremental way, if I can talk properly. And when children hit that age of formal learning, where there are ongoing gaps with readiness, I'm aware of what those gaps are already, and I know which areas of development they are located in. Does the child who is not ready, do they have gaps with all of the skills that they need? Or are some of their skills at a level of readiness, but they've got one or two skills that have got ongoing gaps there? But if I've had that systematic approach to preparation, even when there are ongoing gaps, the gaps aren't as extensive as they would have been if I hadn't had that systematic approach. And I also have that awareness of, alongside more formal learning, what is it that I need to put in place specifically to work this child towards a level of readiness, and that's really important. If I'm saying a child is not ready, what does not ready look like? What does it sound like for this child? And therefore, what do I need to put in place? And I think it's really important that we embrace, we identify and explore the gaps that make up that not readiness, so that we actually know what they are and what needs to put in place. But what we really don't want to do is to ignore that gut feeling that this child isn't ready. And if I have that bottom-up approach to preparation, as I transition my children from the very early years into more formal learning, and in England we would call that reception, we can have that information to hand. But again, if I'm bringing children in from other settings that might not have as systematic an approach, then these are the skills that I will want to look at quite quickly for my children coming into school from elsewhere. Either looking at all of my children just to make sure they are really ready, but again, definitely looking for gaps where I'm suspecting that a child may have them. So, like I've already said, if we're saying some children are not ready, we need to embrace that, and we need to really think in a systematic way, what does our provision look like when those children are not ready? And a lot of people in the world of phonics, for sure, will kind of disregard the notion nowadays of children not being ready. But I think for real long-term outcomes and progression, we need to actually tackle it, and upskill ourselves to be able to identify the gaps that are making that child not ready, but also understand and have a really systematic plan of attack to work that child towards a point of readiness. And once we are kind of thinking about preparation and what is a point of readiness, which is basically, I suppose, that where we can get started with formal learning, preparation isn't just about the very early years. I also need to be mindful of what is the ongoing skill development that will support the next phase of learning, the next phase of progression, so that again, in my practice, I can make sure that I'm not just trying to get my children to this level and then I'm going to stop any thoughts about child development. It's like, great, I've got this child to a point of readiness, but actually, this skill still needs to develop further, because when learning gets harder, for want of a better phrase, when we move on to the next level of learning, when learning becomes more independent, they're going to need more than just this basic level of readiness. So let's explore a couple of areas. But like I say, in future newsletters, we are going to unpick key formal areas of learning in more detail. But I would just want to introduce a couple of areas more so that we can talk around the concept of a developmental gap identification approach underpinning and alongside. So what I'm not going to do here is to talk about one SSP over and above another. The message that I am giving, it sits alongside and sits underneath any SSP, kind of as long as the SSP is strong and as long as you teach it consistently and well, what I am saying will stand for Little Wandle, it will stand for read writing, or the many other SSPs that are out there. And I am not talking here about messing with the fidelity to your scheme. I'm talking about really looking at preparation and readiness and having a gap identification process that can sit alongside your SSP, because although people will tell us that this SSP will work for all children, we all know that there are children with gaps who struggle and who don't make the progress with an SSP and an SSP intervention program alone. So let's think about what we already know and which kind of a gap identification and a skill-based approach would continue to emphasize. We already know that auditory and listening skills are particularly important. Traditionally, we've always built those auditory discrimination skills, where children can move to a point where they can hear sounds in words, not just beginning sounds, but end and middle sounds. But we also need to understand how that develops from the very, very beginning, and that developmental kind of knowledge will also help us to go back where older children have gaps. We already know that phonological awareness is important, and preparation diets, traditional preparation diets, have always concentrated on listening and phonological awareness. But again, we need to have a rigorous approach where we realize that phonological awareness is a set of key skills, and that each of those skills develop in a specific and incremental order. So how do I move my children with those skills to a point of readiness, but how do I have a structure where I can go back where children have gaps? But actually, I need to develop more than listening and more than phonological awareness. There are some deeper language-based and other developmental skills that we often miss out of the equation when we're thinking about phonics and readiness and progression. And a skill that is so crucial that I talk about a lot is this notion of auditory memory, but also sequential auditory memory, the ability to hold environmental sounds, musical sounds in our memory, to hold a number of sounds and to hold them in the right order, but also the skill that overlaps with receptive language, which is the ability to hold words, an increasing number of words. And also to hold that increasing number of words gradually in the right order, that sequential auditory memory for understanding. So again, we can find that children with auditory and language-based gaps can struggle with phonics because of those language and auditory processing issues. So that maybe what they need is not just more phonological awareness. We need to go back deeper to more fundamental skills. And these skills will drastically affect children's readiness and ability to blend. They will affect children's ability to hold sounds, to hold sentences, words, and sounds at the same time. So they are massively fundamental to phonics, but also to all aspects of literacy and wider learning too. Um, we often don't think about concept preparation and the need to understand key concepts when it comes to phonics. But children will need to know what beginning, middle, and end mean. They will need to know what same and different mean and nearly the same. They will need to know directional concepts like up, down, round, and across when we're doing letter formation and writing. So, again, a lot of my preparation needs to be about paving that language, conceptual language base for readiness, and to be aware that maybe in reception, when a child doesn't isn't able to identify the sound at the beginning of a word. So when I say what sounds at the beginning of cat, the child smiles at me and says meow. Maybe one of the things is that the child actually doesn't know what I'm asking. They don't understand. They don't know what a beginning is. And again, we've talked about phonological awareness already, but I particularly need children to have auditory blending skills if children are going to move into reading using the phonic approach. We know what we want children to blend, but what we need to know is how that blending develops from the beginning and how we get children to a point where they can blend 3 phonemes, then they can blend 4 phonemes and longer. And that actually there is a very specific order of auditory blending development that it really helps us to understand so that we can move children in a sequenced way towards a point of readiness in the early years, but also when a child can't blend at the level that we need them to. First of all, we can check their sequential auditory memory base. Do they have that foundation to underpin blending? But also, if they can't blend at that level, what can they blend if I go back through that developmental structure? These are really important questions to ask in order to facilitate progression. But often they're questions that we're not encouraged to ask because we're just told to keep going and keep repeating, blending at the level that we want the child to blend at, but that at the moment they cannot. Whereas we're talking about identifying the gap, the reason why, and finding that level of success and moving that child more quickly towards blending by actually embracing and tackling that gap rather than just ignoring it. And also, we often don't think about how children move on. So we are really fortunate in the early years if when we're doing some preparation work, I could get a pen out of a feely bag and could say to a child, oh, I've got a pen. Pen, what sounds at the beginning of pen? And it's great if I can get my children to that point of readiness where they can tell me that it's a p. But what I also need as children move into formal learning of phonics, but alongside that, I need that skill to keep going and for them to have a skill called phoneme identification, which is nearly the same as auditory discrimination. So when I say pen, what sounds at the beginning of pen, of course, I need them to understand what the beginning is and what a sound is. But they are primarily using their auditory discrimination skills with a little bit of visual support because there's a visual sound. And that's great. But if the child wants to and needs to move towards independent writing, they need to be able to think of and say the word, not just the word pen, but any word, but let's keep that same word example. If they want to write pen, they need to generate that word themselves, say it in their heads or even say it out loud. And then they need to be able to still identify the sounds from their own internal or from their own productions of words. And that's a deeper skill. And many of our children who, dare I say, need to be spoon-fed words in order to write them down, where the adult needs to sit alongside them and almost like break the sound, the word down for them, one sound at a time, will not have moved on to this skill level. So we can kind of push that child and get some level of writing down, but that child will really struggle to move into independent writing without that depth of skill. And of course, it's not just about auditory and language and phonological awareness. Of course, those are hugely important. But of course, children will also need to have the visual skills in order to be letter ready and to cope with flashcard learning, to cope with the move from dissimilar letters to similar letters, to cope with the move to digraphs and trigraphs, to cope with split digraphs and to be able to see those within a word. And of course, word level reading as well, which is massively important. And also, if I'm expecting my children to write all of this down as well as just learn to read, then our motor skills will be fundamentally important for our children. So, yeah. So, if we want to be able to identify gaps and tackle gaps through our systematic preparation, but also alongside our more formal teaching, we need to realize that there are lots of gaps that can come into play, but that different gaps will have different impacts on children's readiness. So chances are, if a child struggles with letters, then it will be a visual gap. But if they struggle with hearing sounds in words but can recognize letters, then it's not going to be visual, it's going to be more of an auditory or a receptive language issue. So, although some of our children will have gaps with all of the skills that feed into phonic readiness and for phonic progression, what we will actually find for most of our children is some children will have age-related skills in some areas, but gaps within others. And kind of we can learn how to kind of correlate that with children's outcomes. Let's just have a very quick look at writing. A lot of the skills that we've just talked about in phonics overlap with writing, not just because we need a level of phonics in order to build writing skills, but because a lot of the skills that we've talked about are deeply fundamental. So, in terms of having a strategy where we want to look at readiness and progression with writing, we need to acknowledge, I suppose, first and foremost, that writing is vast and that actually it's useful to subsection writing up into like the mechanics of writing, not just letter formation, but moving on to kind of word level and extended writing skills. We need that sequential auditory base so that children can hold sounds, they can hold words, they can hold sentences, they can hold words and sounds. So that is a really important, deep foundation skill for not just phonics, but for writing and other areas of literacy and wider learning as well. We've already talked a little bit about the phonics skills for writing. And children will need to have not just phonics skills, but they'll need to have syllable and word level skills, which will morph into spelling so that children have that visual memory of what keywords and particular particularly common word looks like, and then they'll establish a motor program for those words. But one of the things that is often the thing that we very much need to focus on, but which sometimes we can leave a little bit behind, not always, but is the language base of writing. And I think we know that oracy feeds into literacy. We know that having an oracy approach will kind of improve our writing. But I suppose what I'm talking about is having a more systematic and specific understanding of the language base that children will need for writing. And our gut instinct is to equate writing outcomes with levels of talk. And I can see where that kind of gut instinct comes from, because generally children with strong levels of talk will also have stronger, most of the time, stronger, deeper language skills as well. And so their strong levels of talk usually equate, as long as children have got the other skills that they need, usually equate with better writing outcomes. But where children have language needs, where children have gaps, we need to understand that the connection between language and writing goes deeper than just language and talk, the language for talk and the language for writing. That there are a lot of skills that allow a child to talk well, in the same way those very same skills are the building blocks that allow a child to write well. So I am not saying that expressive language and how children use sentences, their sentence length and their grammatical structure, of course that is important. I'm just saying we need to consider a wider and a more holistic set of skills. So again, we're going to look at writing in more detail very, very soon. But let's just have a think about what those deeper skills are. Always that sequential auditory memory, that ability to hold words, that ability to hold an increasing number of words, that ability to hold words in the right order, that ability to hold words whilst you're busy doing something else and still remember what has been said. Essential, absolutely essential. And on top of that, we need to also give our children a vocabulary base that will allow them to not just understand words that we have said, but so that they can select a range of words in order to formulate sentences and to know different ways of saying these things. And of course, concepts are important so that children can use adjectives well. Nouns are really important so children have a strong noun base to pull on when they're writing. But a really key set of words is children's pot of verb vocabulary, that those words where children can describe, either verbally if they're talking, or to describe by writing what is happening, what happened, what is going to happen. And often we can have children with a dearth of verb vocabulary, or children who overuse very general verbs like do, put, and got, which really limits not just their ability to talk, but their ability to write. But we'll unpick that more in the future. And also, what I really want is not just for my children to know words in a basic way. I want my children to understand how words go together, so that how these words go together because they're all in the same topic, or these words go together because they're all things that you can open, or these words go together because they're all things that have got a handle, or these things go together because they are all things that are shiny. This is about vocabulary skill. So it's not just knowing words in a simplistic way, it's knowing that commonality of meaning and how things go together. And the understanding of those links between words will greatly underpin particularly children's reading comprehension and their ability to move towards inferencing and prediction. But when I use those connections to generate ideas and to pull words out, as I talk, but also to pull ideas and words out as I want to write something down. That idea generation skill will be really, really crucial for my writing. Um, and they're two sides of the same coin, but obviously the understanding of the connections comes first, and the ability to use those connections comes second. So again, if we're looking at preparing children for writing, our motor work is important. But if we're wanting to tackle the language base for writing, what does our provision look like in terms of building these word connections and what we call these semantic skills, these vocabulary skills? And although it seems kind of a bit unusual, we also need to realize that those key language skills that underpin play and imagination, there's skills that allowed the child to play in the home corner when they were younger, the skills that allowed them to utilize the small world and then do a running commentary and then a sequence of running commentary, which kind of is really a precursor to storytelling. Those skills will really lay the foundations for writing. And so, again, if we've got writing issues with slightly older children, but we still have some continuous provision, are we going to make sure that we create opportunities within that continuous provision to build those very specific pre-writing skills that some of our children still have gaps with? But also my social communication skills, my awareness of other children, other people, other people's emotions will greatly affect my higher level writing as I get older, so that I can be clearer when I'm trying to communicate sequences of information, so I can be clear when I'm trying to describe and name a topic, but also so that I can write for different audiences and understand how the words and the language that I use can create a sense of emotion or anticipation, for example, in another person. So all of these things are important. So I suppose as a leader and as an individual teacher or practitioner, what we will often do is we will often say, right, okay, well, for a lot of our children, it's this set of skills that greatly influence children's readiness for phonics or readiness for writing. So what we'll do is we'll concentrate on these skills first, and then over time, we will begin to embrace a wider set of skills within our strategy for more formal learning. So a lot of this is about your children and the gaps they have. And it's also about, well, what have you got in place already? What do you need to do a bit more of? What skills do you need to consider? Where are the gaps? Not just with the children, but where is it that you might need to do a bit more of working on a key skill? Um, but also what we're doing is we're not implementing or we're not advocating just a one size fits all program. Do this with all of your children, and then your writing outcomes will improve, or do this with all of your children and do the same with everybody, and your phonic outcomes will improve. What we're actually saying is the more we can upskill ourselves to understand the skills, the more we can actually have a thorough approach to preparation, make better judgments about readiness, about not readiness, and the more we can begin to tackle and address ongoing gaps. So in future newsletters, we will unpick phonics in more detail. We'll unpick writing as well as reading. This is more about introducing the concept of a skill-based approach alongside more formal learning. If you don't get the newsletters directly, then you can email us at toolkit@launchpadforliteracy.co.uk, or it might be that members of your team wish to receive them directly, so just get them to email us. Or it might be that you want to share this CPD and these opportunities with other people outside your school or setting. So again, if you want to do that, that's what people need to do to sign up, and we will get that sorted for you, no problem. Again, thanks for your time.